I'm excited to welcome Peter Weinberg. Peter Weinberg is a global lead at the LinkedIn B2B Institute, where he researches and develops contrarian, and that's a key word here, contrarian marketing strategies designed to give LinkedIn's clients a competitive edge. Peter has spent the majority of his career at LinkedIn in various sales and consulting roles. Prior to LinkedIn, Peter worked in creative planning at Dentsu. In fact, I think we overlapped briefly there, and media planning at Group M. Outside of LinkedIn, Peter is a profoundly unsuccessful science fiction novelist and a devoted Nintendo player. Peter was born, raised, and eventually will die on the island of Manhattan in New York City, or at least so says his bio. So welcome, Peter. How are you? And I guess I don't have to ask where you are.
No, you don't, Drew. I am right here on the island of Manhattan, although I'm ashamed to admit I recently moved to Brooklyn, so I might need to update that bio. But I can, as long as I come back to die in Manhattan, the bio will be
It
accurate.
will be. And, I mean, isn't Brooklyn the new Manhattan
Yeah,
anyway?
it's just New York City. It's all
Yeah,
one.
you're far cooler now that you're in Brooklyn. I just
I
have to
like to
say,
think
you
so.
you
I
you
need
really have your cool points. Manhattan is just so old, It's just
100%. So
yeah,
so so 1850s, Brooklyn is
it,
just the future.
it is. All right. Well, speaking of the future, we've got a lot of ground to cover. And because you've done so much research over the years that supports spending more on demand creation, and we'll call that that brand spending, than on demand capture. And I just want to point out for huddlers, we talk about this difference a lot over the course of the years, the difference between demand creation and demand capture. And Peter, just so you know, there are a lot of CMOs who will not use the word brand internally because brand feels like squishy stuff that doesn't drive revenue. So the
I
terms
know.
demand creation and demand capture are very, those are acceptable words in a lot of C-suites. So, but we know here, and this is there's a question in here. We know that's not where most B2B marketers are doing. In other words, we got a weird echo. Someone, hopefully you go on mute. Let's start with the evidence that you've gathered that supports spending more on demand creation versus demand capture. And I know there's a different balance for B2B than B2C, but what's the evidence that supports that this actually works?
That's a great question, Drew. It's the $1 billion question. Yes, as you said, first and foremost, B2B marketers, especially very overinvested at the bottom of the funnel, tend to invest very little at the top of the funnel. It's really what we do here at the B2B Institute over the past 5 years. We've just been trying to make the case for top of funnel investments using empirical research that ties to financial outcomes that like CFOs can understand, who are often one of the biggest barriers to brand investment. So you asked about the evidence. I guess I would say three things. First, I think there's a very underrated data set in the world, which is called common sense. Common sense, very underrated empirical data source. So what would the common sense answer to the question be? It would basically just be like this. You cannot buy a brand that you don't know exists and that you've never heard of. It's like physically impossible, right? If you don't know something exists, you cannot purchase it. So to the extent that the job of brand or demand creation is to let people know the brand exists, well, just basic common sense would say in the sequence of events, you need to have that before you can have anything else, right? And then, of course, we also know from common sense, we don't usually buy brands that we've never heard of. I think we are inherently suspicious of like a weird company we've never heard of. I mean, imagine two people come to pitch for your CRM business. One is Salesforce. The other is like Jimmy's Discount Consulting CRM Shack. I think 9 out of 10, maybe 10 out of 10 people are going to go with Salesforce just because it's familiar. And the fact that it's familiar tells you a lot about the strength and credibility of the organization. So that's the common sense argument. If you're not swayed by common sense, I think there's two really good empirical data points that you could use. The first is the research from Les Binet and Peter Field, who are mentors of mine and really the first people that we partnered with at the B2B Institute. So for those of you who don't know, Burnett and Field are these British gentlemen, and they've gotten very famous for a very simple idea, which is just that there are two types of marketing, what you're calling demand creation, demand capture. They call it brand building and sales activation. But whatever you call it, their key idea is that you need a balance between these two things. And what they do is they look at econometrics. So they look at like empirical data showing we did X from a marketing perspective, and then we saw Y from a financial perspective. They look at business effects, by which we mean revenue growth, profit growth, market share growth, et cetera. And the key idea they've gotten famous for is the 60-40 rule, which is that your financial performance is maximized when you've got something like 60% at the top of the funnel spent there, 40% at the bottom of the funnel. We did the first ever B2B cut. So we just looked at the B2B econometric cases in the IPA data bank, and it was more like a 50-50 split. But again, that's the recommendation. What you really see in B2B is more like a 199 split, where nobody's really doing anything at the top of the funnel. So there's Common Sense, there's Burnett and Field. And then the final one I'll reference is the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, probably the most important marketing think tank on the planet right now. And they have this idea of mental availability, which we could probably talk more about, Drew, but that's just how easily a brand comes to mind in a buying situation. And there is a 95% correlation between your mental availability, how easily you come to mind, and your actual like buyer penetration, so how many customers you have. So Common Sense, and then 2 data points that link these marketing metrics, brand marketing metrics, to financial outcomes. And after 5 years, that's probably the best I could do to answer that question.
All right. Well, we're going to take these one at a time. I think it was Harry Truman who said, if common sense were so common, more people would have it.
Yeah,
so
100%. It's uncommon, very uncommon.
It is a little uncommon. But I think as I'm imagining this conversation between the CMO and the CEO and the CFO, and they just went through the last 5 purchases they did, asked them how many brands that they purchased, they bought from companies that they had never heard of. The answer is 0. Sort of the second part of that is ask every salesperson how it felt when they called somebody and said, "Where are you from?" and how that went. So there is a way to build sort of more anecdotal support for the common sense thought. The Burnett and Fields balance thing, let's go into that for a second. I can imagine, so if we got all the folks that are on our call right now, and there's a goodly number of folks, and we said 50-50 is what you're going to spend top of the funnel versus sales activation, as you call it, or demand capture, as we often call it here, they'd roll their eyes and say, good luck. There's just no way that I could sell that. So let's dive into that a little bit more and see what ammunition we could help them give it, because it sounds, I think a lot of B2B marketers, and some of them have B2C in their background, they know inherently what you're saying makes sense, but going to a PE firm or going to a VC firm and saying, hey, we need to respend our money, we're spending it wrong. And these people, by the way, they're talking to aren't stupid.
Mm-hmm.
But they want revenue this quarter. They want demand this quarter. And so how do you sell 50-50?
Yeah, listen, first and foremost, it's not easy, right? If it was easy, most people would be spending 50-50. They're not. They're spending 199. So, I'm not out here telling you this is like just a simple conversation. You just got to whip out 3 PowerPoint slides and you'll be spending 50% of your money at the top of the funnel. It's not easy. But I'll go back to that word you used, contrarian, Drew, because we are obsessed with contrarian ideas. And the reason we're obsessed with contrarian ideas is because it gives you a competitive advantage. If you do something that everybody else is doing, then you get average returns. If you do something nobody's doing and it's the right thing, you get above average returns, or alpha. So to me, in other words, like the fact that it's so hard to sell in brand is why it's such a huge opportunity, because if you're investing in brand, you could be one of the only CMOs doing it. I'll give a shout out to Brian Law, who I just learned is on the call. Brian Law, one of the few CMOs who's very well versed in the Ehrenberg Bass research and has used it successfully to make the case for brand internally. And ZoomInfo is running a brand marketing campaign, which is actually a pretty novel concept in B2B. So it's rare, but it's possible. And the fact that it's rare and possible is the opportunity. But I guess to answer your question more directly, Drew, like, how do you make the case? I think you start by, you need to explain the difference between short-term results and long-term results, right? And that's, again, not easy to do. People struggle to balance long-term results with short-term results. In civilization, you see that pay out with like climate change and the national debt, right? People think short-term. And of course, it's true in business. But I think the truth is, in business, this is not a totally foreign concept. Like, most people know that long-term growth is actually more important than short-term growth. You can't just play long because I think you referenced the famous John Maynard Keynes quote, right? In the short term, we're all dead. But like, let's say you work at a public company and you look at your stock price. You say, okay, what goes into my stock price? An analyst would tell you something like 80% of the value of your stock is based on future cash flows that will not come in for 10 plus years. So I think there's this misconception that like Wall Street, totally short term, we've got to be short term. But actually, Wall Street is mostly evaluating firms based on how many sales they're going to do in the future from future buyers. So then you have to ask yourself, okay, 80% of my value is from future customers. How do I influence future customers who don't need CRM or analytics or business insurance right now? How do I influence that audience, which is about 95% of the market that doesn't need to buy the category right now? Well, saying like buy now, buy now, buy now, buy now, not going to really work on people who won't need to buy the category for 5 years. It's really more about building a memory of the brand that is likely to be recalled when people enter the market. So I think there's a way to like work backwards from finance and say, what does finance care about? They care about future cash flows. Where do future cash flows come from? They come from future customers. How do we influence future customers? It's about, again, building these like long-term memory structures in the minds of buyers. But Drew, I don't think these things should be positioned as totally binary. Like, there's already a question, can you do both? I think it's helpful to think of these as separate activities because the type of creative, for example, that builds a long-term memory is a little different from the type of creative that gets somebody to buy right now. But it is fair to say that like an ad, let's say, an ad that works in the long term will also work in the short term. If you have a highly effective brand campaign, you should start to see results, pour in right away from the people who are in market for the category. The problem is, again, 95% of people are not in market. So most of the effects are going to be distributed into the future, which again is a financial concept. That's amortization, right? That's a capital investment. Like, you build a factory, the revenue is not recognized in the next quarter. It's recognized over many, many future quarters. So brand marketing works like that. It works like CapEx, even though it's like reported on as OpEx. So all of this is an unexpectedly long-winded way of saying, like, there's ways to connect marketing language and brand marketing language to financial language. And I think we as marketers need to lean more into that. Instead, we've leaned into, like, I would say the opposite, things like brand purpose, brand perceptions, things that are like actually inherently not financial sounding. And that's why you see a lot of friction between finance and marketing.
Right. So we're talking about investments. We're using language that CFOs understand. They're investing in capital, they're investing in R&D, and they're investing in the notion of long-term market creation versus, if you will, long-term capture versus short-term capture. I get it. And I don't think there's anybody on this call right now that would argue with this necessarily. I just do think that you're in the long term, we'll all be dead quote here. CMOs don't necessarily have a long term. And so we talk, they have a pretty short window. So I guess what we need to understand is if we have 2 to 3 years to do this in an average tenure, and you're going to put your money to increase the odds, if you want to stay at this company, to 4 years or 5 years, the payout that you're talking about is 18 months, 24 months, 36 months. So I think we need to define the long-term a little bit better to help CMOs sort of go, okay, this isn't going to help in 6 months, but it is going to help in 18 kind of thing. And so is there any math in that area?
Yeah, I think there absolutely is. First of all, again, not easy. There is what's called a principal agent problem here, right? Like our personal motivations as a CMO or as a marketer, not necessarily aligned always with like what is in the best interest of the business, right? Like if marketing works over decades and most marketers are not in their job for decades, that's an incentive problem, right? Creative, like generally sticking with your old creative is more effective than launching new creative. But what marketers like to stick with, their predecessors' creative. You don't win a Cannes Lion for running last year's creative. So there is like a fundamental incentive problem. And I'd say we can't probably capture that today, Drew. But,
All
I
right.
think, I think you do have to quantify these things. Like the reason why the bottom of funnel marketers get all the money from finance is because they walk in with things that look like financial models that say, if you spend more money here, you'll get this many leads, which will convert into X number of sales. And finance says, okay, I can basically understand that. Then the brand marketer comes in with their like mood boards and like brand personality. And it looks like arts and crafts versus finance and math, which was what the bottom of funnel people came on. So all of that is to say, I think there are ways to quantify the value and impact of top of funnel marketing. It's not always as easy, but it's possible. And it's measuring things like mental availability, which we can talk more about, but it's measuring the likelihood that your brand will come to mind in a variety of buying situations. And are you increasing that number over time? And then there's a series of sub metrics that determine whether your mental availability is going up or down. So I think it does start with leaning into the quantitative nature of brand instead of the qualitative and creative aspect of brand that I think is really what's been emphasized over the past 10 years, 20 years, which is why to your original point, Drew, like brand has a brand problem, has been rebranded by a lot of marketers who are allergic to the term, understandably so, because it has that like non-quantitative.
Right. And so the thing about demand generation and demand capture is, okay, that sounds like it's aligned with the business. So I don't have a problem with folks not using the term brand, but you talk about a mental availability. Let's go into that a little bit in terms of what that looks like from a measurability standpoint, and how that sort of plays out a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this Ehrenberg-Bass revolution, which has really revolutionized CPG marketing at places like Mars and Procter & Gamble, and you see it starting to spill over into other B2C categories and B2B, this idea of mental availability is like the bedrock concept in the Ehrenberg-Bass revolution. I always think, Drew, it's easiest to just demonstrate it with an experiment. Would you like to participate in a psychological experiment, Drew? Do I have your consent?
Yes, please. Let's do it.
Okay, so let's try this. Let's say you're on a tropical beach in Cancun and you need to order a beer. What brand comes to mind?
Dos Equis.
Dos Equis, interesting. Anyone on the call? What would people say? Give me in the chat, maybe. I don't like Dos Equis, so now I have to fish a great Corona. It's actually funny. So I would say when you ask people in the world that, like 9 out of 10 times they say Corona, 1 out of 10 times they say Dos Equis, which tells you there is like a probabilistic nature to which brand comes to mind. But I digress. Let's switch. Okay, Drew. Now let's say you're at an Irish pub in Dublin. What beer comes to mind?
Guinness.
Great. Everyone else? Anyone else have any non-Guinness? And Guinness. So everywhere in the world, you hear Corona and you hear Guinness. That's not because like the universe dictated that you must order Coronas on tropical beaches and you must order Guinness in pubs. It's because of the marketing department. It's because the marketing department has tied the brand to that buying situation, or what's called a category entry point in the academic research. Corona's advertising is all find your beach. It's pictures of beaches with a Corona, Guinness's advertising is all people in Irish pubs drinking Guinness. So it's like overly simplistic to say which brands come to mind when you need a beer, because within that category, there's many, many different situations in which you buy a beer, and different brands come to mind in different situations. And that is basically what mental availability is. It's the likelihood that your brand comes to mind in a variety of different buying situations. So to switch from beer, I always get fixated on beer, which is starting to alarm a number of people, but I'll switch to CRM, okay? People don't buy CRM. There is like 30 different or 33 actually different buying situations for CRM. Some people want to forecast sales better next quarter. Some people want to do marketing automation. Some people want to deliver personalized interactions to customers. 3 unique buying situations. Different brands are retrieved in those different situations. If you ask buyers, which brand do you think of in this CRM buying situation, you get one set of brands, another, you get another set of brands. And if you do a leaderboard, and we have one actually, I can share, you'll see the biggest brand, Salesforce, it's the biggest brand because something like 90% of buyers think of it in at least one situation. And on average, people think of it in about 13 different situations versus a small brand, like let's say Twilio, only 50% of buyers can link it to even one situation, and it's like 5 situations on average. So if you're Salesforce, how are you going to grow? You're going to grow by linking the brand to more situations. There's 33, you're only thought of in 14. If you're Twilio, you need that too, but it's more like at least make sure 90% of the market can think of you in one situation. So big brands can probably go after multiple buying situations. Small brands have to be a little more focused maybe on one situation. But I'll just go back, Drew, to this is a more commercial framing of what brand marketing does. If you say, we're thought of as 2 points more sexy and innovative to your CFO, they're like, okay, cool. Like, thank you. Please get out of my office.
But meta availability, I mean, in some ways, the notion of share of voice is baked into that as well, right? Because in theory, share of voice and brand, there's some correlation between your likelihood to have in somebody's brain is higher if your share of voice is higher, right? So, okay, we have a couple of questions that I want, and a comment. So, Brian Law, again, getting mentioned several times, shout out. He did
great marketer.
Doing a recent session with Aaron Burbass for demand versus brand. And what it really talked about is that brand work should also have a short-term impact. And this is a question that we also got from the audience. Like a trade show, in theory, could do both, right? Because you're seeing you can capture interest right then, and you can generate interest on a broader level with the audience at the trade show. So I don't know, is there a question here? So, but I guess the key point here is don't call demand generation don't call it only long-term, right? Because in theory, it could, if you do it right, could have a short-term impact as well, right?
Yeah, the reason I brought it up is I think they refer to it as like brand is not like some time bomb where like nothing happens and all of a sudden it explodes. If it's going to work, it has to start showing you indications that it's going to work. It's just the combination of those that they're additive over time.
Okay, what are the indications? Sorry, Brian.
Like you should be seeing sort of improvements in sort of your funnel performance. So like, I mean, an example was something that we did with LinkedIn is when people saw the brand ad, they were more likely to engage with our demand ads. And so there are ways to actually start to see sort of initial indications that will give you confidence that it's going to be beneficial over time. So you're not just hoping and thinking, I hope I don't get fired because I just spent a lot of money and I'm not going to know for a year. You do need to find out if it's actually having meaningful impact.
And just to be clear, because this goes to you are isolated. The messaging and the creative that you do for top of the funnel work is different than the messaging that you're doing for demand capture. Is that right, Brian? I know, Peter, that's part of this conversation is that it needs to be different. It's not buy. It's planting a seed in someone's mind.
Yeah, so at least the way that we're doing it, that is thinking about mental availability. What are those buying situations? What are the thoughts, feelings, emotions that are triggered in those buying situations? Ideally, where is there a white space between how people are thinking about your category and then how they're thinking about you and your competitors, and then figuring out which of those are like the lowest hanging fruit to take advantage of, and then really trying to attach your brand to those category entry points, as Peter alluded to. So that's sort of like the top of funnel messaging and really what at least we're trying to focus on.
Okay, thank you, Brian. So, and that gives me a chance to sort of, Peter, let's talk about category entry points and what really means that. And then I do want to talk about creativity, because I know that's a big part of this too. It's not just spending money. You can't do boring brand work and cut through. So, but let's talk about category entry points and what that's all about.
Yeah, category entry points is pretty straightforward. You start here. You start with the 95-5 rule, which is probably the hottest concept we have here at the B2B Institute, which we stole from the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, but it's neither here nor there. So what is the 95-5 rule? It's that in any category, CRM, beer, business insurance, it doesn't really matter. There are two segments: people who need to buy the category right now, people who are going to buy the category in the future, people who are in an Irish pub right now looking to buy a beer, and people who are not currently in an Irish pub but will be at 5 p.m. The second it hits 5 p.m., cross the street, go to an Irish pub, right? And in any category, something like 95% of people are not in the category to buy. They are future buyers, and they become the 5% who are in market. So category entry points, very simply, you could think of as the pathways into the category. So again, it's like 95% of the time you don't need CRM, but when you do, there's 33 category entry points that move you from a not needing CRM buyer to a you need a CRM solution right now. So it's really a critical point, because I'd say both at the bottom and top of funnel, you need to be aligned around those specific situations. You need to understand that, hey, the big entryway or gateway into the category is that people need to forecast next year's sales. So let's make sure our top of funnel marketing says, think of Salesforce when you need to forecast next year's sales. And then let's make sure our bottom of funnel creative is more like, hey, if you need to forecast sales right now, like talk to a sales rep, or here's a demo of how you can use Salesforce to forecast sales better, right? Which gets to the point of the creative being a little different, because it's for in-market versus out-market, but they're both aligned around the same category entry points. Every category has different category entry points. So you need to identify what they are, and then you need to choose the ones that are the most valuable for you, which is a whole other methodology, but that's like the basic concept, Drew.
Yeah, got it. And so I just want to step back on many of the research sources that you've cited or documents that you have. We'll put links here, and we also have links on cmohuddles.com, so you can see the CMO scorebook, which is a recent a scorecard, white paper. We'll include the link in chat right now, and also in the show notes, where a lot of this other research is referenced. It occurs to me, and I'm thinking that some of the CMOs may be wondering about this too, which is sometimes your customers or prospects don't know they need your product or service. In fact, they're not in the market at all until you somehow or other create the need, help them see the problem they did. When you present the problem, they go, oh yeah, I do have that problem. My demand thing over here and my CRM are not speaking to each other. I need some kind of interim code. That would be nice. And they hadn't recognized they had the problem. Talk a little bit about that's different than, everybody's in you're going to buy a car, if you're going to buy a car and you don't live in New York City, but, and you're going to buy a car every X number of years. And so they're going to cycle through, and at some point their old car is going to die and they're going to need it. There's a lot of products out there that are being sold that are not replacements or substitutions. They're additive.
Mm-hmm.
Where does that fit in this sort of plan? I mean, in some ways, because you're selling a kind of a new way of doing things, you probably need to do more brand work, but what's your thinking on that?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting topic. I meet a lot of marketers, especially in B2B tech, where I spend a lot of time, who are all like, well, I have an entirely new category that didn't exist before. So like, surely, there's something different about my marketing situation. And I would argue there's really not, because here's the thing. These category entry points, first thing to know about them is they exist whether your brand exists or not. Like whether there was Salesforce or not, people would need to forecast next year's sales in some way, and they would just find some other solution and some like more cumbersome solution prior to the existence of CRM, right? So like Uber, let's take Uber. Everyone's like, Uber, totally revolutionizing company, transformed transportation forever. the category entry points for Uber are like, hey, I need to get from A to B. Like I need to get from Manhattan to Brooklyn.
Right.
Like that was a category entry point in like 1776, right? So the category entry points are really pretty stable in time in a category. It's just that there's new solutions to them. So I think if you're in a new category, it's still about linking your brand to those category entry points. And I think a key thing to understand from my perspective, Drew, is like, I think we have this mental model in marketing that we put buyers in market. In other words, if we have really good, compelling creative, we can force somebody to like stop what they're doing, click on the ad, and go buy our CRM solution. And most people laugh when I say that because they know intuitively that's not how marketing works. But actually, we very much measure marketing on how well it does that. The reality is like, you don't put people in market, the universe puts people in market. There's a great quote from Erwin Efron on this, where he's like, the cereal ad didn't get Mary to buy cereal, the empty cereal box did, So it's like, you're kind of more just like lying in wait, constantly saying, hey, whenever you're in this situation, think of Salesforce. And then through factors mostly out of your control, eventually somebody will hit that situation and you'll make sure you're the brand that comes to mind. So I think even in new categories, they're old category entry points. And fundamentally, it's about understanding that the marketer doesn't move the customer in market. The customer moves themselves in market.
Interesting. Okay. I'd love to go deeper on that one, but we have so much ground to cover. And one of the things that you talk a lot about, and I think there's even a formula for, it's like creativity times media equals impact or something. I'm struggling to find that note. Creative times media equals outcomes. So let's talk about creative and its impact. And because and I know that there's kind of a lack of creativity in B2B in general. And I'll say at least there's a lack of distinctiveness. Like
Yes.
If you turn the sound off and you didn't see the last frame, you would think, oh, that's 10 different brands. It could be any one of brands, right? So talk a little bit about creativity and why it's more important than ever.
Yeah. I mean, let's go back to this. It's about being mentally available. What does that mean? It means it's about being remembered in a future buying situation. So all of my clients, like everyone in marketing thinks they have a lead gen problem and that their job is lead gen, but actually their job is mostly memory generation. It's making sure you build this memory of the brand that is retrieved in the future when somebody encounters one of those category entry points. So in other words, like the key metric is memorability. So how do you drive memorability? Well, of course, there's a media component because you need to actually reach a customer. If you don't reach a customer, nothing else can possibly happen. So reach is like a gating factor on marketing effectiveness. But then how effective your reach is and how well it converts into sales is almost entirely a function of how good your creative is. And really, when I say how good your creative is, I mean, how memorable is your creative? How likely is it that somebody will remember having seen the ad, remember the brand in the ad, and remember it, in some cases, 6 months or 6 years from now, right? So you need really good, memorable creative, and probably won't come as a surprise to many of you that like B2B marketers don't really have that. This is probably the least popular research I've ever done in my life, where we took something like 2,000 B2B ads and we tested them for creative effectiveness and memorability. We tested them on a 1 to 5 scale. So 5 stars, very good, memorable creative, 1 star, super forgettable, boring creative. In B2B, something like 80% of ads scored 1 star, which means they're just like completely forgettable creative. So that is like, there is an absolute crisis of creativity in B2B. If I had to diagnose why, Drew, it's like there's a bunch of factors. There is what you mentioned, distinctiveness, which is everyone's ads look exactly the same. They're all blue. It's all digital transformation. They look the same. They're saying the same things. It's always like people in suits shaking hands, or that weird like sci-fi thing where the guy has his hand here and there's all those, what I'm talking about? Like stock imagery, stock generic branding. And that means it's not going to cut through because it's just boring, looks like everything else. And it's not going to get attributed to the brand, like it'll probably just get attributed to whoever the biggest player is in the space. Sometimes you're accidentally marketing for competitors, essentially. So, the fundamental problem in B2B is that our creative is super boring. It's all about product features and benefits. It's always like 11% better ROI. And if you don't need CRM right now, that's just like not an interesting or useful message. It goes in one ear, out the other. And that's really the problem we have. We have a crisis of memorable creative in B2B.
And you talked a little bit, you used the term weird and that weird can work. And I love the term, and thinking about it a lot once I saw it on there as part of a trigger, but I can't think of I'm trying to find a weird B2B brand. And, there's moments in time, particularly during their startup phase, where they sort of feel weird a little bit, and then they lose it. Like they get another round of funding and then everything gets homogenized.
Yep.
Are there any weird B2B brands out there?
Yeah, you got to be weird. I mean, in life and in marketing, there's this great concept. I think it's called the Van Restroop effect, but it's basically like humans notice incongruous things. It's like if I show you a picture of 50 black sheep and then there's one red sheep, you'll be like, you'll notice the red sheep. Like you notice things that don't blend in, but actually stand out. And, it's easy to extend the metaphor into advertising where you see 50 B2B tech ads and you want to be the one that doesn't look like the 49 other ads, which requires you to be what I would call weird, or what Aaron Bass would call like distinctive, like uniquely like yourself and not like anyone else. So that is kind of the key concept. Brands that do it well in B2B, I mean, there's very few. Salesforce is one we talk about a lot. It's actually kind of the journey you mentioned, Drew, where like at first Salesforce branding was really weird when the campaign or when the company launched. Then they got into the enterprise and it became like soulless and boring. And then there's really been a revitalization at Salesforce over the past like 5 years, where if you look at their advertising, it's like talking like woodland creatures. Is this guy Astro, a little kid in a raccoon costume. And marketers are always like, what are they doing? That's insane. It's so crazy and weird. It has nothing to do with CRM. And I'm like, or like my category is so boring, I could never do that. And I'm like, hey, is car insurance an interesting category? No. What are the biggest brands in car insurance? Geico. How does Geico sell car insurance? They sell it with a talking British gecko, right? So it's like things don't need to make sense to work. In fact, the more nonsensical, often the better they work. So Salesforce, I think, does as well. MailChimp is a company I've been spending a little more time with. I think they do it very well. They've got they call it absurdism. Like their creative is just super weird, like bat human creatures. And again, I know many of you are probably saying I could never do that, but like to me, that's the opportunity. It's like because nobody else is doing it, it's a foundation for true distinctiveness and cut through and memorability.
So I could imagine the CMO saying, okay, I want to go spend 50% on brand building, doing some kind of weird creative. And I would love to sell that in, but I can't. So I'm wondering, and I also listened to one of your other presentations, and you talked about big bets and putting a lot of money against, one big idea. So is there any way in your mind, and have you seen this, where a B2B brand did a side test where they actually tested some weird stuff against in some way so that they could make the business case, look, this was 4 times more effective, both at top of the funnel and at capturing the attention. Is there anything that suggests that this is testable so they could at least not have to bet the ranch on it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's all testable in a variety of ways. You could run one super boring ad and one less boring, weird ad. Again, weird is a spectrum. Like there's like, talking heads weird. And then there's like, I don't know, I can't even think of a mildly weird, So you don't have to go full weird, but you could be mildly weird. You could run weird and boring. And you could measure, for instance, like ad recall. What percentage of people, when you survey them afterwards, remember having seen the creative. And I think you'll find that people much more likely to remember the weird, incongruous thing than the thing that looked like every other thing. I think the other thing, Drew, a lot of my most sophisticated clients, they test everything through market holdouts. So they'll literally just say, like, in Estonia, we're going to run top of funnel brand with weird emotional creative and bottom of funnel lead gen marketing. In, Tasmania, we're going to do no brand, straight lead gen. And then we're just going to compare what happens in those markets in a quarter, in a year, ideally in multiple years. And it pretty much always, that's why these are empirical concepts. They replicate, like, you pretty consistently get the result that the market with the brand support performs better than the one without. The weird ads are generally more memorable than the boring ads. I mean, these things prove out.
Love that. I was thinking exactly the same thing for international companies. They could definitely use countries that were willing to do it. And the risk is probably more than manageable. And the results could be dramatic because you could have this, you change your mix, your messaging mix, you change your spending mix, and you could sort of isolate the variables there. So one quick thing, one of the things that this just so reminds me of P&G's always on, right? That you really talk about this in B2B, not just B2C, where spending every week is taking your budget, dividing it in 52 is better than creating spikes going on, going off. Can you just sort of defend that thesis?
Yeah, I can. It's really funny. Like, we've spent a lot of time with the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, which I'm sorry I keep bringing up to the uninitiated, but to the initiated, this is like the holy grail of marketing. And, one time I asked Professor Byron Sharp, I'm like, you have so many contrarian recommendations. Which one makes the biggest impact, like when a customer implements it? And without question, he's like, when I get customers to spend their media more evenly over time than in bursts, which is kind of weird because people don't usually they think of creative as an arbitrage opportunity. They think less about media as an arbitrage opportunity. But the key point, I'll keep going back to this 95-5 rule. Most of the people are not in market. At some point, they will be in the market. The problem is it's very hard to know when someone is going to enter the market. And as a result, you just kind of need to be always on, spaced out over time, pacing and spacing, so that likely they go in market as close as possible to having seen that, like, reminder of the brand. So, like, people talk about reach and frequency. We think more about reach and recency. In other words, how recently did they see the creative from when they actually went into the market? And that's where, like, spacing works very well. Most clients, they spend all of their money in, like, let's say December. And then you're like, hey, why did you do that? And they're like, well, if I didn't spend my budget in December, I was going to lose it in January. So, like, their media planning, in other words, is mostly dictated by, like, internal political considerations, not how I would do it, which is I would say, look at your sales for a year. If they're pretty evenly distributed across the year, then your media needs to be pretty evenly distributed across the year, because it means people are constantly entering the market every month. If you have a highly seasonal business, like I used to work on Miracle Grow, which, by the way, was a very bad fit for me as a Manhattan, New York City native, talking about, like, the gardening category. But, they spent most of their money in spring, because guess what? Like, that's when most people enter the market for planting, and Miracle Grow. So generally, if your sales are evenly distributed, your media should be evenly distributed instead of this, like, big burst spending and then going dark. Again, I'll come back to finance. You talk to a financial advisor, first thing they'll tell you, don't try to time the market. Don't try to buy and sell stocks at very particular moments. Focus on time in market. In other words, how consistently are you invested? And if you're consistently invested over time, the performance goes up and to the right. Marketers, I think, with all due respect, are grossly overconfident that they can time the market and time the customer and hit them at that exact moment or right before that moment when they go in market. We'd be better off focusing on time in market and saying, how consistently are we in market with this very consistent messaging, so that you get those kind of, like, compounding annual returns.
So yeah, we're going to have a highly distinctive, consistent message with as much reach as we can afford, because you argue that reach kind of correlates to share in some ways or another, right? And certainly if you have a higher share of voice and you have a higher share of mind, in theory, you're going to have a higher share market. And there's some data in one of those studies that connects an increase in share of voice with an increase in share of market, right? It's not as direct as it is for B2C, but it's still a pretty good correlation.
Yeah, it's actually a little better in B2B. So this is called ESOV efficiency. You know, some in more technical terms, it's kind of like advertising elasticity, but it's basically how much sales do you get for a set amount of reach? And again, reach, which has been much poo-pooed in recent years as a metric, like reach is one of the most, if not the most important metric to gauge your marketing effectiveness. Because as I said, if you don't reach anyone, you can't possibly influence them. Everything is predicated on reach. And so basically what you have in the Binet and Field literature is this idea that for every 10 points of extra share of voice, so that's share of voice in excess of your market share. So if you have 10 points of market share, 20 points share of voice, that would be 10 points. You get about 0.7% market share growth per year for that amount of reach. And creative is what would bend the curve. So if you have really good creative, maybe you get 1% market share. If you have really bad creative, maybe you get 0.2% market share. And B2C, the average is actually like 0.6 versus 0.7. So it's not a huge difference, but you could argue like B2B is actually more responsive to reach and advertising than B2C. And you do see huge variance across categories. You see like for retail, it's 0.2, for durables, it's 0.9. So different categories respond differently to reach, but there is a correlation, and it's one of those rare things, a marketing metric, share of voice, that is directly correlated to a financial metric, which is growth. And that I think is like really the power of reach-based budgeting, or, you know, thinking about ESOV as a key performance indicator.
I do want to go back to one thing. Well, first of all, for folks who are looking for examples of breakthrough and memorable creative, we're going to do our best after the conversation to try to gather some. Thank you, Margaret, for sharing the Cisco Valentine gift. We're going to try to find more. It's hard. It's really hard. There's just a lot of folks that aren't that are spending on demand. And so it's on capture and not creation. And when you're spending money on capture, it tends to be more rational. It tends to be less creative. Now, at one point, there is in the sales process, you do talk about the need to be more rational, right? There is a point where, okay, you can leave the silliness aside, that someone is looking for some information. Can you talk about that distinction?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, okay, you don't need CRM. Now suddenly you need CRM. If you go talk to Salesforce when you're in market for CRM and they come in with like the talking woodland creatures, you'd be like, yeah, okay, no, but like, I'm really interested in like the pricing model. Like, can you show me some proof that this thing will help me forecast sales more accurately? So once you are in market, there is a bit more rational consideration that takes place. And that's where I think there is a market for more product feature specific messaging. But I just would stress, like, first of all, most of the processing is not rational. It's like unconscious or psychological versus logical. And then also, you can only rationalize the brands you already know exist and have thought of. So the research is pretty clear that like when you go in market, you usually think of about 2 brands, and like 80 or 90% of the time you choose one of those 2 brands. So what may make the difference for those 2 brands is like how good is their rational sales pitch and product marketing and sales process. It may make a difference there, but like where the real drop off is for most brands is they're not one of those 2 brands. So it's like your number one focus should be qualifying for that race. And then you need to worry about like running the race faster than your competitors. And again, some of that rational messaging can help there, but it shouldn't take the emphasis off, being a brand that people can even rationalize because they know it exists, which is what the top of funnel type marketing delivers.
And, as I think about the 5 to 95% ratio, a lot of this is based on the fact that you expect 5% of your prospect pool will be in the market for your product or service like we'd say in the next 12 months.
Quarter, let's say.
Or a quarter in the next 90 days. That may be high for some categories.
Very high. 95.5 is a heuristic, it's just to say that the reason I feel comfortable calling it a law is because I don't think you can find any category in which most people are looking to buy that category like right now at this moment. In any given category, most people are not currently in market, and that'll be where the percentage is skewed. But 95.5 is general. You brought up cars. People buy cars on average every 10 years, which means 10% is up for grabs in a year. And then you have to subdivide that by 4 to know how many are in market for a quarter. How often do people buy new business banking services? That's like every 3 years on average. So there's a bit bigger. We just came out with research on financial services, and it's more like 16% of, for example, SMB customers buy a financial service in a given quarter. So it's not 95.5, it's 1684, but the rule still holds, which is that most of your customers are not in market and you're mostly influencing future buyers, not the in-market buyer. But it's important, to your point, Drew, to know what that is for your category, because that's how you set proper expectations with the business. Business, the CFO and the CRO needs to understand that the amount of leads you bring in a quarter is dependent or conditional upon how many people are buying the category that quarter. And because that's a small number, like there really is a ceiling of how much sales you could possibly drive in a short term. Most of the sales will be distributed across future quarters. And I think that's a key concept marketers need to understand, and then they need to explain that to their cross-functional stakeholders.
And there's so much, I guess these days, so much online behavior that would indicate they're in the market. And if you actually did the math on that, you'd probably see it for yourself that you might, lots of companies, they've got their 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 companies that they want to do business with. But if they looked at actually the folks that are going to Trust Radius or G2 to look at that, or people that are going to read analyst reports or some of those other things that are early signs of buying, you might find what that number is for your category.
Yeah. And listen, it's big enough that you should care about it. Like, I'm not saying you should just ignore anyone who's in market and only talk to future buyers. It's just, you need to understand it's a relatively small opportunity. It's not really where you're going to make your money. Your money will be built, getting ahead of that moment. Pre-suasion, you could call it, versus like persuasion.
So let's just talk, and we're going to wrap up very quickly, but, do you talk about brand as a value, as an asset? And is that something that you measure? I mean, I know there are other organizations that do brand sort of asset valuation kind of things. Is that a factor in any of this?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. Brand is an asset. It lives on the balance sheet. I mean, for many years, clients would be like, what do you mean by brand? What is brand building? And I would give these kind of like long, incoherent answers. And now I'm like, okay, if you're Coca-Cola, what is your brand? Your brand is your distinctive assets. It is the name Coca-Cola. It's the red and white color. It's the scripted font. It's the polar bear. Like, those are the thing. That is what your brand is. It's just a series of assets, in many cases, visual assets that you put on things so that people know who they belong to. That's the original definition of a brand, right? It's like you put it on a cow, people know who the cow belongs to. That's your brand. The value of those assets is dependent on how many people know about them and how many different situations they are linked to. So Coca-Cola is a very valuable brand because it has so many assets, and those assets are known by pretty much everyone, and they are constantly linking themselves to more and more situations in which you should buy Coke. And then they also have incredible physical availability or distribution, so that if you want a Coke, it's never more than within arm's reach, as Coca-Cola famously says. So I do think, if you look at research, most firms, their valuation is based on intangible assets. And then you're like, what's an intangible asset? You click on the balance sheet. What is it? It's literally like trademarks. It's your logo. It's your name. Those things have value, intangible value, but value nonetheless, that lives on your balance sheet, that will be realized if, let's say, your company is bought. And your goal as a marketer, I think, is to build up those brand assets and increase the value of the assets by doing all of the things we're talking about. And that can be measured. It really can. You just show people, let's say, your logo with your name removed, and you ask them, what percentage of you recognize this logo? And if you're Geico, 100% of people say, I recognize the Geico. Then you ask, cool, who does the Geico belong to? 100% of them say Geico. They don't say Progressive. They don't say State Farm. So that's an asset that's incredibly valuable because it's 100% fame, 100% uniqueness, 100% recognition, 100% attribution. And if you're a good marketer, you're growing the valuation of those assets over time. So that's kind of how I would think about it.
So, and just to put a loop on this, so the gecko, there's some debate about whether it's British or Australian or
I could
there's
never
a little bit,
myself.
it's somewhere in there. But I want to sum up with a statement that you said. The definition for the purpose of a brand is to help customers make fast and easy decisions. The purpose of a brand is to help customers make fast and easy decisions. I think that's such a profound and simple way to be thinking about this. Because if you can help your customers make fast and easy decisions, you win, right? Whether they're in the market or not in the market later on. So there's so much in the various research that I look forward for the huddlers for sharing all this with you. Let's wrap up, Peter, with 2 do's and 1 don't for B2B CMOs when it comes to sort of getting more out of their marketing in the context of everything we just talked about. 2 do's and 1 don't.
Sure. I think it's easy for me. Do invest in top of funnel, not just bottom of funnel. Invest in distinctive, consistent creative that you run year after year to as many buyers as you can possibly reach. So top of funnel, consistent creative, broad reach among category buyers. What you should not do is the exact opposite, which is what most marketers do in B2B, which is it's all bottom of funnel. It's all real-time changing creative based on product features, and it's all hyper-targeted to the CEO at the pharmaceutical company in Minneapolis with 10,000 employees, right? So it is literally the inverse of that. And that, I think, is the big opportunity in B2B and to a certain extent B2C as well.
And by the way, as you think about it, the chances are every one of your competitors is not doing that.
Correct.
They're spending 95% of their dollars on the 5% of the folks that are in the market right now.
100%.
And so boom, they're
source of competitive advantage, which I think is hard to come by. Super important.
All right, from your lips to the CEO and CFO's purse, we will do this. Okay, well, Peter Weinberg, thank you so much for joining us. Where can huddlers find you?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Hugely appreciate it. LinkedIn is my platform of choice. I post a steady stream of obnoxious contrarian opinions there. So would love to connect with you there. And you can always send me a message if you want to talk about any of the concepts or how we could work together on them. But really hugely appreciate the invitation.
Our pleasure, and thank you.